With governments around the world opening consultations and some already implementing mandatory vaccination for their citizens, my guest, an expert in health law, policy and ethics, talked about the implications of the mandatory vaccination policy for citizens. But first, I began by asking her about how she felt when her name was announced as the winner of the biggest literary prize in Africa.
I think it's going to take a while to move on, mostly because I still have, people reaching out, congratulating, and from time to time you still have to pinch yourself and say that that's happened. And have even, literary agents, people in the literature circles reach out to you. So it is a big deal, and I think it takes a little time to move on. That said, for a writer, life continues. You just have to keep churning out those words and writing and, taking care of all the difficulties and challenges that come with writing. So you're never really just in that place where all you're doing is celebrating and giving yourself a high five.
And no one has asked you for a little money?
There is that, but I think it comes with the territory, and that's fine.
So in terms of all of the caps that you wear, professor of law, writer, how do you manage to do all of them together and do them so well?
I often say that it's not as glamorous as it looks. In addition to the things you mentioned, I also run a law firm in my area of specialization, health ethics and law consulting, and I run a non-profit called CHILD. So I do have my hands quite full, and of course I have family commitments like most of us. I think I go about it by not thinking about it, by just plugging in and doing whatever needs to be done, and finding sometimes at the end of the day that you haven't really done some things, or you haven't done them as well as you could have hoped. But we're thankful for the opportunities that come along to do things. I enjoy the different spaces that I inhabit, the different things that I do, and they give me challenges that make me happy and excited to get up every morning. It's not as glamorous as it looks anyway. I think that's all I'm going to say. It's a lot of hard work.
So let's look at what's happening in Nigeria now. Yes. You followed the End SARS panel, the white paper, the reports of the Lekki Toll incident, and the different arguments in favor and against. What's your take?
My take is that the End SARS movement was an epochal moment in Nigerian history. And when I look back on the events of that night, I live very close to the toll gate. I heard the gunshots, and it took me aback to see how the denials at first and so on. And I was one of those who really welcomed the setting up of a panel of inquiry into that. And when I looked at some of the people that were selected to be on the panel, I was really encouraged to think that the government itself was willing to let things come to light and have us deal squarely with whatever came to light. So it's been a bit of a surprise to then see that when these women and men of integrity had spent months, a lot of time doing very serious investigations, taking their time to listen to the testimonies, and came up with this paper that we have had the sort of reaction that we have had. I know that many, and I would count myself amongst them, have felt a bit disappointed at the reception, because the idea really I had hoped was for us to bring these things to light and then to deal with them, to ensure that justice was done to those who were directly affected, but justice for all of us Nigerians. Because when people think about that time and what transpired, at those gates. I think for many people it did change their perception, regardless of where they were, regardless of other things that they had been through. I think it's, I hope that the government takes another look and maybe thinks differently and begins to speak a little bit differently about those events.
But another truth is that even aside from the government, you have lawyers with divergent views on, you know, what powers the Lagos State government has to implementing the recommendations and whatnot, and the powers of the federal government. And, you know, we're also hearing from the federal government on those powers. So when you have lawyers giving these views, what do you think the populace thinks about the whole thing?
I have very carefully not spoken about, you know, just legality, because I think that sometimes we focus on technicalities and we forget what's important, right? You have a group of young people saying we're being murdered, basically, by certain police officers. And let's be clear, there are other police officers that have done their work, that do their work on a regular basis. So let's not use a brush, you know, a broad brush to, you know, sweep over everyone. But if this happened, and it did happen, as the reports have now clearly stated, what should we do? Yes, perhaps the Lagos State government does not have, you know, authority over the army, but it does have authority to say, what can we do with these families? How can we take responsibility? What can we do about the gates itself? What kind of memorials do we need to set up to ensure that people understand that we feel their pain? So there are things that, so we can talk legality, we can start looking at the sections of the, you know, of tribunals, laws and things like that. We can start looking at exclusive lists of the constitution and who has authority to declare, to set soldiers and unarmed civilians. We can do that, or we can do the real work that we need to do, right? Which is, say, government should be protecting people, not harming them. And where we have failed to do that, what should we do? At all levels, at the federal level, at the state level, and at all levels.
So are you comfortable with the position of the Lagos State government in what they've taken in their white paper of the panel report?
What is, I would like to say, in terms of their position, I would like to see them really take responsibility for the report. You have, you know, you set up this panel, you chose the people that you felt were people of integrity, decent, well-equipped, highly qualified people. It is hard to imagine that you will not take their report and do some introspection.
All right, let's talk about health. You're also, I mean, an expert in health law. What's your view? First, we have this Omicron variant that's just really affecting the whole world, and several countries are already taking decisions, restricting other countries from coming in. But I want us to talk about the vaccines. The federal government has said federal civil servants by a certain date all should be vaccinated. A lot of them still feel it's their choice to or not to, I mean, to accept or to refuse the vaccines. Where is the human rights there that protects the citizen against vaccinations that, you know, they don't want to take part in?
As we have seen, public health emergencies can shut the world down. It can shut down businesses, it can shut down economies, and it reminds us that our health takes precedence over most things, if not everything else. And when you think about public health, you're thinking, yes, there must be a way to balance individual rights with public rights. But you also have to think, we have to protect, you know, the community. You have to protect the public, broadly speaking, even as we fight for rights. I often say, I remember last year there was this hulabo about compulsory vaccination in some of the bills. We've had a long history of compulsory vaccination in Nigeria, starting from, the Vaccination Act back in 1917, with which smallpox was smallpox vaccinations were implemented in Nigeria mandatorily, and which remain on our books. We still have other more recent laws, like the yellow fever vaccination laws. We still have, even as recently as the Child's Rights Act and the Child's Rights laws of different states, which mandate vaccination. So that's not new to us at all. It does say that we understand, we have understood for a very long time the need, sometimes to some degree, to curtail certain rights in favor of protecting the wider populace. If you look at Section 45 of the Constitution, it does allow the government to make laws that sometimes derogate from fundamental rights, certain fundamental rights, and those are the rights in question are specified. So things like right to movement, right to freedom of religion, and all the other rights that are specified there. So in essence, what I'm saying is that if we need to understand that in principle, sometimes, mandates are important to protect all of us, all of us. That said, there are things that need to be weighed. There are things you need to weigh, of course, the risk benefits of doing that. You need to weigh whether or not there are techniques that can be implemented that are not necessarily legal, at first, at least, to get people, to persuade people to willingly and voluntarily see the need. I would say that we still have a lot of work to do in terms of communication, and that perhaps we will get to the point where mandates are necessary, and as I've laid the foundation for saying that mandates are well known to Nigerian law, right? Vaccine mandates.
And then back to your experience with vaccine laws. So now for most of the COVID-19 vaccine manufacturers, there's this indemnity clause where you can actually sue them for side effects as a result of the vaccine. Why is this? And how does that protect those that might have actually suffered severe side effects?
There are all kinds of things that we could do. For example, we could have a fund that, we all sort of chip into. And when I say we, I'm thinking globally now, I'm thinking the world, so that it is that fund that supports. And therefore, this other side of the manufacturers feel like we have some kind of protection too. We're not all alone trying to save the world, but also knowing that we're going to lose out entirely, because that takes away the incentive to get into the R&D and to get into the development of vaccines. So, I mean, we could have a longer conversation about this, but I think it's not something that is so straightforward when you look at the competing interests. But it is something that requires solidarity and countries not having to work on their own.
Thank you so much for talking to us this morning.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.